Okay, welcome to everybody. So we get started with the second day of our conference. So we enjoyed yesterday dinner, but I see that almost everybody is here in time, so thanks for being here. Today we will start with a roundtable on AI and democracy, and I give the floor to Deirdre Carting, who's the head of the law department here, and has also an interest for law and technology issues. So I'm very happy to give her the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Giovanni, and welcome all again back here on this beautiful Saturday morning. I apologize that I wasn't able to be here myself yesterday. Unfortunately, we had a clashing doctoral event that lasted the whole day, but certainly the program looks absolutely fascinating and highly relevant also for Europe and for those of us in the European Union that are not only grappling directly with the issue of artificial intelligence and robotics, but those of us, myself included, who aren't specifically, but are doing things that clearly impact around it, be it data protection, security, cooperation, interoperability of databases, all that sort of thing. So I think it's a wonderful opportunity for various people to come together. I see, Giovanni, that in the beginning you aim that it's a matchmaking environment linking private and public, but also linking the United States and Europe, the European Union specifically. And I'd congratulate you because you've certainly brought together a very impressive and relevant group of people. I'm not going to talk any further because my main task this morning is to ensure that we actually have time for discussion before we break for the next keynote address, which is important at 11. So that's my main task. So I will very briefly, on the assumption that you probably know most people, introduce and then give the floor to, we have 7 panelists this morning, which is rather a lot, but some of you have assured me you will speak for less than the 10 minutes. In any event, you won't speak for more than the 10 minutes. So you can interpret that as you will. So I'll start by giving the floor to Alexander Drexel, who also has to leave us a tiny bit earlier because that's the problem when you're here as well, that you're rushing to doctoral events, and in his case, an important, as all doctoral defences are important, but it takes place at 11 in another building of the EUI. Professor Drexel probably needs no introduction to you, but he's a professor of political science. He was a long time here at the EUI as in the political SPS department, also head of department there before he left. And he is now based in Switzerland since 2006, where he works as a professor of political science at the University of Lucerne. So without further ado, Alex, I'll give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Deirdre, for this kind introduction, and apologies again from my side. I have indeed this defense at 11 in the Badia, and there's a pre-defense meeting, etc. And it's one of my, I'm co-supervisor there, so I should be there. So I was asked to only address this roundtable with a few minutes of thoughts on AI and democracy. I've been working a lot on democracy and the linkage between technology and democracy, but not so much yet about artificial intelligence and democracy, which are clearly two areas or two fields, two topics that can touch each other. The two stand, I would say, in some kind of bi-directional relationship to each other. On the one hand, AI may affect democracy, and I think on the other hand it may well be that democracy can also affect AI. So let me first very briefly touch upon this first causal arrow going from AI towards democracy. So clearly the most central area of democracy and of the working of democracy is elections and referendums. Here, very clearly, artificial intelligence can impact on voting procedures, on electoral structures. To give an example, one could imagine that AI-enabled technology may help designing electoral districts through algorithms that can learn from the violation of legal and political principles in order to achieve more equal representation. It's a big issue, as you know, in the United States, for example. You have to redraw these electoral districts on a regular basis, and it often leads to inequalities. One can also imagine post-electoral or even in real time, during elections, autonomous kind of fraud detection systems with algorithms that could learn from electoral fraud in the past, the patterns that arose, and learn from one election to the other and flag the fraud. AI may directly impact not only on structures, but also clearly on actors in elections and referendums. And here, of course, the most important actors are the citizens, the candidates, the political parties, but also the media, of course, of all sorts, and providing and those who are providing them. Now, artificial intelligence can very strongly affect the information environment or ecosystem within which public opinion is formed and in which this public opinion formation process takes place. And this is arguably the most important area of the electoral process. So AI can be optimized, I'd say, to the point that voters would not even have to learn anything about politics anymore. With enough data produced by voters, and there is quite a lot in Western liberal democracies, as we know, machine learning would allow for predicting one's own vote even better than we can do it ourselves, based on our behavior, on our preferences that we have, etc. Of course, systems like that start existing, but they still need, for example, the voting advice applications, which are not AI, but could be AI-enabled at some point, where you still need the active input of citizens to declare their preferences, etc. But that could be very easily imagined to be replaced at some point by algorithms that know better than we do about our own political preferences. But this kind of election automation, right, could thus lead to some kind of robotic representation, a robotic representation that would also make sure that any action that representatives take is also taken into account in the calculus for any voter at the next election. So the idea is that you could have a scrutiny of what is going on in Parliament, what representatives are doing automatically, and adapt the matching with the voters on a continuous basis. So in all of this, AI would be some kind of optimization of the electoral process, making the choices more precise, making the matching more precise between the voters' preferences, and make sure that this congruence between those who represent and those who are represented would be at the maximum. But what would one then still need a parliament for, or a government, as a matter of fact? If all of the political decision-making can be AI optimized, then it becomes clearly more efficient. Now, that's probably undeniable, but efficiency is often at odds with legitimacy. And I think that such AI optimized or even replaced democracy would start using, would start doing without the traditional chain of accountability between an accounter and an accountee, between a principal and an agent. So the two would simply become one and the same, matched on a continuous basis by artificial intelligence. And in this case, however, AI-optimized decision-making would become accountable to itself. And I think such a form of reflective accountability can actually work, but it can only work if there are some kind of sanctions between the accounter and the accountee, so that the principal can indeed sanction the agent if he or she is not happy with the work of the agent. Now, artificial intelligence would therefore have to be optimized to sanction itself, which is, possible. It's not impossible, but rather maybe even more difficult than expected. So a functioning of sanctioning oneself, limitation of one's own power. And I think that the main difficulty, of course, arises from the fact that morality, ethics, values, emotions, which are all strongly linked to political decision-making, as a lot of studies show, are very difficult to be modeled. It's not impossible to model those. But the tension between an efficient political decision and a legitimate one, taking all of these dimensions into account, this tension will probably remain for quite some time. And so just very briefly on the second direction that one could think of when it comes to AI and democracy, the other way around, when you think about the impact of democracy on AI, taking AI as the dependent variable, if you want, and democracy as the independent one. Well, I think it's important to think about that relation because not all AI is white, of course. Some of it is quite dark, allowing bots and trolls, etc., to mingle with the electoral process. And it has, of course, also the potential to sabotage an election entirely, right? Or the dealings of a parliament or of an election in a very subtle way, maybe, and even in an undetectable way. So AI has the potential to completely dominate the information environment in which electoral campaigns are fought. And those who control, of course, the information environment have a quite strong position within the electoral process. So it's probably necessary for democracies to deal with AI, including for regulating AI in this realm. So we have to think about how AI can be made more inclusive, how it can be made more transparent, for it to become also more democratic. There's this large debate about algorithmic accountability that is out there, which is not only a buzzword, but clearly shows a perceived need for bringing actually the working of algorithms, of AI in particular, closer to the wider public and its democratic scrutiny. So these are quite just a few thoughts to start off the debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. I would say they're not just a few thoughts, they're very fundamental thoughts, and they immediately, I'm extremely happy with this because they immediately put to the forefront the fundamental issues in terms of, in any event, systems of representative and possibly participatory democracy. And you've immediately, I know you probably discussed it from the program yesterday, the issue of transparency and accountability. But this is the panel in which to discuss this actually very directly, and certainly the prospect of AI, as you call it, AI, not only optimized, in inverted commas, I suppose, democracy, but also replaced democracy is something that needs to be thought about in quite fundamental terms, but it seems to me also that we perhaps need to think about it in new terms, because the way in which we think about transparency normally and government or governance and also accountability of government or governance is different potentially in this context. And it's for that reason that I'm also very glad that there's such a multidisciplinary panel that has been put together of economists, political scientists and lawyers. But given that Alex will be leaving us and not joining us for the discussion, I just thought I would allow a few minutes. I mean, I know it's early and you haven't had your coffee break yet, but nevertheless, you've been warming up all day yesterday. So if there are... You can't see me, but right, okay, because I just thought let's take some minutes to have benefit having Alex with us to have a debate, if there's a desire to have that. Great. So Ryan, on the basis that I couldn't see you, you're first.
Thanks for those really interesting remarks. And so my question is, you talked about this tension between efficiency and legitimacy, which I think is absolutely critical, right? And it reminds me of debates about the very nature of bureaucracy. So in the United States, we have a famous admin scholar by the name of Jerry Mashaw, who talks about bureaucratic justice and identifies that same tension, right? Ultimately, what you want is a bureaucracy with its efficiencies and so on, but we want it to have a human face, and he talks about the tension between efficiency and process values. Do you think that the question of artificial intelligence is different from bureaucracy? Does it present the same tension, or is it a different one?
Shall we maybe gather a few questions? Bertian, you wanted to come in.
Yes, thank you also very much for these thoughts. I can understand the theoretical argument that you might want to do away with elections once you can predict people's preferences very much, but it always strikes me that this will fix people's preferences at a certain point in time, because the preferences will be based on what at that point in time people might have voted, but the subsequent vote, 4 years later, people might think, well, I voted wrong last time, so I would now vote something different. But you cannot really derive that from new data gathered in between, simply because there is no mechanism in which people could show that they thought they voted wrongly last time. And I wonder how the automation of voting in that sense could ever be dynamic and change over time.
Okay, all right, would you like to take these two first, and then I'll take another round? Yeah,
yes, of course. Well, thank you very much for these very thoughtful questions, which are difficult to answer. I mean, is AI different from bureaucracy when it comes to this tension between efficiency and legitimacy? I think there are many common points, of course, absolutely. It's a classic dilemma that we have in politics as well, right? The dictator is extremely efficient, but not very legitimate. And if everybody votes on everything, that's very legitimate, but not very efficient. So you know, if you plot that in a 2x2, with the two vertical axis, efficiency and legitimacy, you would have this kind of cross. And the intersection there is what we have called parliament, where you have a few that represent, etc., and that try to. And with AI being potentially able to actually produce very efficient decisions where many people are involved, in a sense it could be helping solving this. But of course, this is I have lots of doubts there. But I think in the principle there are very similar issues at stake. Maybe very quickly regarding the change over time, preference change. Yes, well, I mean, the idea is that artificial intelligence would be picking up of what you are doing in your daily life, what you do on your phone, etc., and where you basically show that you are not very happy with what is going on in Parliament, for example, that there is a mismatch. So maybe you have been voting for somebody because the algorithm told you should so because you're clearly against nuclear energy, and you voted for a party that starts to be, you know, making deals in nuclear energy, in which case there will be, some kind of increase of a gap between your preferences and what is happening, and then you can sanction on the basis that the promises were not fulfilled. I mean, this is of course not something I would say that we should go towards, but it's possible to do it. And therefore it raises questions. Is this actually good or not? It would take away the ability for parliamentarians to make deals, to debate with each other, say, I give you this, you give me that in exchange, etc., to go a little bit away from what they have been promising, which I think is essential. Otherwise, you would not need a parliament anymore. Yeah.
Okay, this is clearly touched on very fundamental issues on which now a lot of people want to come in, but I'm going to have to be tough on this. So I have a number of people still on the list. I'm not going to take any more because we will have time for discussion at the end, and it's important we hear the other panelists too. Kate, you can briefly, because you're also a panelist.
Thank you. So I think that there's a bunch of stuff that you've mentioned, and I think that it bears kind of a more sophisticated understanding of both, I think, kind of AI and also kind of digging into the questions a little bit more. So the first is that you said something that kind of strikes me as really problematic in the sense that you said, can AI be optimized for government and for voting? So can we predict people's preferences? And I want to know what you mean by preferences. Are these revealed preferences? Are these not revealed preferences? There are huge problems with taking into account people's non-revealed preferences. There are inherent biases that we have, and we specifically legislate against to try to avoid people's, to try to be better versions of ourselves than the versions that we unconsciously reveal through algorithms or online. You said that if everyone votes, then you get more legitimacy, but it's not very efficient. And I don't think that either of those things are necessarily true. That just seems like all you get is populism, and that's necessarily not even a good form of government, which is just something that's worth unpacking simply on its own. And I think that what you're kind of describing just now in your response also bothers me, because I think that you're talking about a level of responsiveness of AI that is specifically what someone who believes in Republican democracy thinks should be avoided, which is that you should have thoughtful, constructive, deliberative feedback, and not super responsive, super trigger happy, super let's take into account everyone's whim and fancy at the very second that they think of something type of approach to voting on a person or a topic or anything else. So I just think that there just is a lot to go into with what you said, that I think these are issues that'll come up through the course of this conversation, hopefully, and that we can continue to have a dialogue about.
Okay, yeah, a few other people, you don't need to come in. Okay, and because you wanted to say something, but maybe into the mic.
Just very briefly, I was curious about the extent to which, so Ryan was saying, how is this different from the conversation about bureaucracy versus legitimacy? The extent to which you think this is a distinct conversation from talking about the roles that other sorts of political intermediaries already play. So, we have these conversations about fake news, with which you're very familiar, and other conversations about news personalization, and they're obviously existing, before we get to a strong form AI that acts as some sort of AI butler and represents us directly in voting, whether you think that there's something different about that AI butler situation than news that is targeted intensely to individuals and sort of claims to match them with their preferences but doesn't actually.
Okay, Alex, you've probably got more than you bargained for.
Super quick, yeah. So, okay, I would like to avoid a misunderstanding. I am not normatively claiming that we should go there, that this is a good thing. So that I think that, only totally responsive and not responsible government, because there's a big tension there, quoting Peter Mayer on that, would be good. Of course not. It's just a matter of fact that our preferences, revealed or not, can be measured, and can be measured by sensors and by what we're doing in our daily life. And if you put that together, we have seen that when you do it, and that is research that has just been recently published in Journal of Politics, when you work on voting advice applications where people reveal their preferences to themselves, actually, and the algorithm matches this with the preferences of the partisan offer, you will see that a certain process of self-persuasion takes place, right? People believe in what they see, and it's just an algorithm that shows them that they stand where they stand in the political landscape. All I say is it's a small step from there to actually make the input, not be necessary, the active input of the citizens not be necessary. Is that a good thing? No, I don't think so at all, because it takes away the whole reflection about politics. It's thoughtless politics in this case. Of course, that's not good. Populism, I couldn't disagree more with you. I'm not talking about populism here, of course. I'm Swiss, so I come from a system where everybody votes on almost everything, and it works arguably pretty well. There are some pitfalls, but there is direct democracy. There are referendums that work quite well, where you don't necessarily have the ghost of populism affecting the electoral process on a permanent basis. I know where you're coming from, and of course there is the danger of that, but it's not like, I think that you can get in referendum processes, if they're well designed, if it's 150 years that you have them, actually to quite legitimate decision making that is highly appreciated by a large majority of the population and all political actors. Regarding the role of news personalization, etc., the bubbles and the etc. Of course, you're right. That is an intermediary that is extremely important. I would have to think more about this nexus between bureaucracy and AI, and to what extent these tensions are there as well. But this is, I just wanted to provoke a little bit, and that worked.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think we're all awake. No, I'm going to now close. I'm sorry. Well, if you can say it in 2 sentences, but not longer.
Yes. What we nowadays call AI is just a way to identify patterns out huge amounts of data. It's not magic. It's not a way to solve all our problems. If we translate that into democracy, we are going the completely wrong way. AI is not able to identify why those patterns are there, what causes those patterns, what those patterns mean. In the same way that AI is not able to understand that it's playing Go, it's just finding patterns in a game, it's not able to understand the patterns of our democratic process. So I think that using AI, at least as we have AI nowadays, and as we translate patterns in big data into something magic, I think we are going in a completely wrong way.
Okay, I'm not sure that it's been argued that we go in that way, but I think we are also seeing the reality in also the public debate, the fear that it's already happening in a way that is not understood. So we clearly need to think about that.
We need to stop talking about AI as being the solution to all problems and the demon or the magic or whatever. It is not, it's just finding patterns.
Okay. We will continue with this discussion also now, but first let me thank Alex very warmly for doing this, for engaging with us, and you now even have more time to con calma, whatever. All right, you leave when you need to. Okay. So we're going to quickly move on to the other panelists, because my goal is that we have time to debate. Clearly these are huge issues and there are major things to talk about also in this panel. Pierluigi Parcu is known to you. He already moderated a session yesterday from the EUI, and as well part-time professor in the Florence School of Regulation and an economist. Pierluigi, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you. Well, I will touch very, very quickly on five things I want just to say very, very quickly. The first is AI is, at least as I perceive it as an economist, is a general purpose technology. That means we don't know what it will do. It's exactly like was internet. 20 years ago, we were, maybe 25, we were in front of internet and we didn't know. There were people that were saying that internet was something that couldn't make money. That was like those little insects that we don't know why they fly, but they fly. In the end, the internet made a lot of money, and I'll come back to this. So anyway, we know that we are in front of something that can change many fields, will affect many fields, and that the economy will be changed. by AI. But especially we heard yesterday, working condition will be changed, probably will improve somehow, but also we are afraid that we may lose a lot of works. And the question is, how accelerated will be this process? Always in losing works is a question of the social tension will depend on the scale, the velocity, the rapidity of the process. So this will be, so we know that AI can be instrumental to a lot of positive things, the pluses of Roberto Viola of yesterday, but can bring new exclusions, especially in terms of works, and maybe new discrimination, what was discussed yesterday under certain angles. So these are the worries, if you want. We have a model, I think, that is the internet experience. Internet has been a bit similar, has changed many things, and I think we are still on the, if there is an exponential curve of growth, we are at the beginning of the curve. If you look at the capitalization of the GAFA plus Microsoft, you see that this capitalization is huge. And this totally, today a bit less totally, but let's say is strongly unconnected with their profit. Capitalization is markets that is telling us that there will be huge profits in the future. They are not there yet in some of these companies. It's a forecast of the market that these companies are changing the world and the way in which the economic world works. So they will make a lot of money. That means that markets are expecting this change. Markets sometimes are wrong. We have seen in 2000 a big mistake, but not often. So where is Europe in all this? That's my third point. Well, Europe is somewhere in the middle, because we know that we are using the internet. Obviously, we are a great user. We have a lot of benefits, like we will use AI in the future, because obviously we are advanced societies with a lot of technical, scientific, economic capacity. But some of our values are under pressure. Some fundamental rights are under pressure. But let me talk a second of economic values. One of our pillars is competition. We want a competition in we want freedom to do business. And we are seeing that some of our instruments are not working anymore. Think to some of the lawyers here know well that we have mergers regulation. We don't want a dominant position to be created through mergers. Well, our merger regulation is totally unable right now to intercept the relevant mergers. It's wrong, it's based on turnover. Turnover is not important. Turnover arrives 10 years after the thing has happened. So maybe we should change it and base it on value of transaction, but sometimes even value of transaction is not the point. Sometimes ideas are bought, people are bought. There is a definition now that is called acquire hiring. That means you buy people that have a good idea. 5-10 million is the market price. And who is able to do this? Only people who have a lot of cash and a lot of competence, people that can look into this. And the question is, how many people are there? How many companies are there of this kind? And the sensation is that the internet model is bringing to us a winner-take-all model, a situation in which there are a lot of large and little overlapping monopolies creating. And Europe has a tension here, it's a problem. This economy based essentially on externalities, direct but mainly indirect externalities, has a logic for this. Is a logic of the largest platform is the best. Dimension counts. And we have to find the ways to counteract all this. But while I'm going through this discussion, because I think that in the populism and all the discussion that we had, there is a lot of this loss of equilibrium also in the economy, this increasing situation of, we are discussing a lot about unfairness, we are discussing a lot about this kind of issue. So I won't enter on this now, and I'll close on focusing on only one final point. That is a point that Alexander was mentioning before, that is the machinery of democracy. Okay, Our machinery of democracy can be also the machinery be put under pressure of all this, because two elements can sum up. This element of inequality, growing inequality and exclusion, and an element in which the machinery is not anymore totally trustworthy. Let me conclude on one point. We have this model. One of the things we do here is this media monitoring instrument in which we look at if the pluralism of media works or not. Okay? Well, we had just a general election here 2 months ago. There were rules to control the media, the traditional media. Everything else was out of control. There was no rules, there was nothing. We don't know if there was political advertising. We don't know if there was political maneuvering. We don't know anything. Is this acceptable? I think that AI can aggravate some of these problems. But if we look and study them and take care before, maybe we can intercept this problem a little bit before. Maybe better than we did with the internet. At least we could learn the lesson. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Pierluigi. These points will certainly come back in the debate, but I'm going to move now quickly to Maciej Kuziemski, with apologies for my mispronunciation. No, he has slides, but he has promised me he will be no longer than 5 minutes. So we're anticipating fulfillment.
Well, that's a challenge indeed.
And he's a political scientist, so we have it.
Great, yeah. Well, thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. Please bear with me. This is quite a challenge for me because it is quite intimidating to not be a lawyer and speak among lawyers. But I'll try to be very brief. That's the first point. But the second one is I'll try to make it interesting because this is about something that lawyers care about, which is words. I want to talk about the meta level of policy making, about values and views, metaphors, and framings that we bring to the table when we discuss AI. And then there is this interesting notion of socio-technical imaginaries that has been coined by Kim and Jasanov from at Harvard, but it comes from obviously from larger considerations of Appadurai and Taylor and others. So socio-technical imaginaries are collectively imagined forms of social life and social order reflected in the design and fulfillment of nation-specific scientific and technological projects. Now, I would debate whether the nation specificity is so important in the case of AI. However, this is the key bottom line is that the way we imagine the future matters for the lock-in of a policy-making process. So socio-technical imaginaries are both descriptive and normative in the way they operate. Now, the deliberations about the role of AI opens a number of questions even from political philosophy. So when we talk about AI, we talk about benevolence, we talk about perfectionism, legitimacy, and social justice. These are a couple of the themes that I've identified, for instance. So and I think a couple of them can be actually viewed in these images that I found that accompany various publications, media representations, and policy publications. So when we talk about benevolence versus perfectionism, we're talking about origins of morality, selflessness on one hand. So what kind of approach do we have to human nature? But then on the other hand, we talk about Mill's possibly greatest utility, happiness, and that opens a question about whether that's aggregate or average. Maybe this leads us into hyper-individualism. Then legitimacy, right? What is legitimate? Are we talking about process, or are we talking about outcomes? Alexander has spoke very eloquently about how it is within political process it is possible to to maximize efficiency of outcomes. So that opens a range of questions. What is justified? So the sort of Robert Dahl versus Joseph Raskin, the kind of discussion. And finally, social justice. What is fair? What are the fair terms of cooperation? What is the new social contract we're discussing? Of course, everyone talks about equality, but for whom? And then there is a number of themes or narratives that emerge from both policy documents and wider considerations and discussions that are out there. And I'll just name a few of them. They, of course, it's a very open-ended list. Then, of course, there's the one that we all know of. Let's say, singularitarian view that is quite conflicted, because on one hand, this is a discussion about human enhancement, so quite kind of anthropo-optimistic, but then on the other hand, it's a discussion of a need of some sort of higher kind of intelligence to rule us all. So a little bit of pessimism as well. Then there's this discussion about existential risk, a kind of cautionary tale about what could happen if we don't focus on regulating, for instance. And one could say that perhaps this actually is muddying the waters of current challenges and kind of undermining the challenges that come with fairness, accountability, transparency debate. Then there's this swing of utopia and dystopia, and I like, I really like late Stephen Hawking's quote, AI will be either best or worst thing for humanity. Really, thanks Stephen, very helpful. I mean, this really doesn't push our debate anywhere, and this is a sort of meta black boxing. You know, this kind of false dichotomy or ambiguity doesn't really helps to place it and ground it in what really matters. Then there's this anthropomorphism. So the talk about robot personhood, etc. And then there's what I see is almost an inverse correlation between this strand and the regard for human rights. Think of Sophia the robot, you know, having a citizenship rights in Saudi Arabia. And then status quo disruption. So everything needs to change. But really, are we talking about everything or just some things? As in, will predatory capitalism change, or only the safety, social safety nets will be destroyed? And then finally, I think two related notions of embedded ethics and human centricity that I think many people in the room are not only familiar with, but are optimistic about. So I'm quite skeptical about embedded ethics. I think it's there are some tendencies for this narrative to kind of place responsibility on the market leadership and voluntary measures rather than regulation and leadership from the public sector, stripping effectively public sector from its regulatory power. And then human centricity, so this kind of universalist notion, we're all equal, etc., etc. That's all cool, but it has a little bit of disregard for cultural nuance. And I'll stop here, and then we'll reconvene the debate. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Maciej. That's wonderful. Thank you for introducing that into our debate. So we turn to the field of computer science, and I give the floor to Professor Dino Pedreschi, who's Professor of Computer Science at the University of Pisa.
Thank you so much for having me here. Yes, my contribution is that of a computer scientist and actually a data scientist. What we actually have in Pisa is a hub of interdisciplinary scientists working with data, essentially, and data-driven modeling to understand social and economic phenomena, and that's what we try to do with interdisciplinary research. As you saw yesterday from my colleague Salvatore Ruggeri, we have a work on explainable AI, trying to make AI algorithm, machine learning algorithm, transparent and accountable. But I would like to talk today very briefly about what we are trying to do on the area of the online conversation. So how can we understand better the dynamics and the impact of online conversation on the formation of public opinion, on all these aspects related to filter bubbles, echo chambers, fake news, and I simply would like to bring to your attention the fact that we actually also need to combine qualitative and quantitative research over and over again to get better understanding of phenomena and possibly suggesting ways to cope with issues. Because certainly one very clearly dramatic effect that we are seeing in our societies, in the Western societies especially, it's even before actually the internet and the web arrived, it's an increasing trend to polarization and radicalization in all sorts of debates. And this also is a threat to democracy in a sense that, when we think about the wisdom of the crowd, the ability of a crowd to be to collectively make reasonable decisions, we know very well from many different scientific perspectives that diversity of opinion in the crowd is essential for the crowd to be intelligent, to be really able to converge towards reasonable. And what we see instead, what the web brought into the conversation is an apparent exacerbation of actually polarized thinking, and certainly this is related to one aspect, which is the goal of main online social media and social networking companies somehow to drive their profit goals. Essentially, if you want to maximize profit, and you're a big social media company, you want to maximize likes, the fact that people like what they access to. If you want to maximize like, you should present to people things that they are probably liking. So things that are close to what they expect, to what they somehow like most. And this makes an algorithmic bias in the platforms where people is over and over confronted with likewise minded people or similar opinions. And we believe this brings somehow less ability to listen to each other and somehow create stronger bubbles and stronger polarized opinions. Now, the question is, can we measure this effect? Can we seriously somehow make experiments where we can understand first whether this is true and how this mechanism unfolds? Because this is a network effect. It's not just a single choice, but it's the combined effect of many individual choice. Now, one exercise I wanted to share in these few minutes very quickly is that we did. We took a very, very simple opinion dynamic model, which is due by Defuan in the early 2000s. A very, very simple agent-based game where essentially you have a population of persons in a crowd. Everybody carries a number between 0 and 1, which is an opinion about something. Imagine that 1 means I'm absolutely in favor, 0 is I'm absolutely contrary, and anything in the middle, it's another. Now, imagine to play this game. You have at the beginning of the game, in the crowd, everybody carries an opinion in a kind of random way. Okay, all opinions are represented in the crowd. Then you play a game where at each step in time, 2 people are randomly selected, and if the distance between their opinion is not too large, so it's not over a certain threshold that you may imagine like the open-mindedness of this population, okay? If this distance is not too large, then the 2 people interact and their opinion become closer, okay? Of course, this is a very well studied, very simple very simple-minded model, trying to focus on the answers of phenomena. And it's been shown that if this open-mindedness threshold, it's about 25%, 0.25, then the crowd converge towards, if you repeat the experiment, and as a network effect, the crowd converge towards an opinion. Below this threshold, say 0.20, actually different opinion emerge, 2 or even more if the open-mindedness is even smaller. Okay, what we did a very simple thing. We instilled in this play, this game, an algorithmic bias of the platform that runs the game, where the algorithmic bias simply means it is not really at random that 2 persons are chosen, but 2 persons are more likely to be chosen if their opinion is closer, okay? So closer minded people are selected more probably than people with a larger difference of opinion. And then we play the game again and see what happens. And what happens is really very, very surprising. First of all, the time to convergence slows down incredibly. So with this mechanism, the system stays for ages before getting a convergence. And essentially, there's a lot of instability, a lot of clusters of opinion that forms and lasts for a long time. The second effect is that actually this, remember this 0.25 threshold, above 0.25 you get one consensus, just one cluster of consensus. Well, this moves up to 33%. So there is a range of open-mindedness where the different opinions emerge as a totally artificial effect. They would be actually converging in the original model, but instead they are not converging, so they are actually polarizing in a totally artificial way, only due to the platform effect and the network effect. I think that this is, of course, something probably not so surprising, maybe, but it's a quantitative effect that can be measured. And my conclusion of this few minutes is that we need to instill values into our platforms, right? We can anticipate the network combined effect of our social mechanisms that we put into our artifacts. And this could be, you know, essentially suggesting like-minded people is an application of artificial intelligence. You can actually do that by machine learning and what we do every day. The point, you can do it very clever, right? But the point is that doing it justified by profit arguments maybe is not a good idea to be done if you understand the overall combined effect of the story, because this is really hacking democracy, right? You are creating artificial divergence. You're putting people against each other in a totally artificial way. And you can measure this effect, and therefore you can also instill in a system, in a platform, the antibodies for avoid that, or actually for instilling just the opposite, trying to put in contact people that have different opinion for possibly aim to different final outcomes. This, I think, is a crucial issue, and it's a crucial issue for Europe, because I think we can compete if we rely on our values and we find ways to instill our values into our technological artifacts.
Thank you very much for introducing that incredibly important perspective into it, and also informing us about these experiments and the relevance to platforms. I think that directly speaks to our topic, and we will have time to discuss it. So moving to Andrea Simoncini, Professor of Constitutional Law at the University of Florence.
So thank you, Deidre, and thank you, Giovanni, for having invited me in this very, very interesting conference. So to address the relation between democracy and AI in 10 minutes is probably impossible. So I will start with two heavy restrictions. The first one, as Deidre was saying, I'm a constitutional lawyer, so I will consider democracy as constitutional democracy. So my perspective is perhaps slightly different from the one of Alex Trexel. So democracy is not only a decision-making procedure or an electoral formula, but is a substantial value deriving from the fundamental idea of the equal freedom and dignity of all the persons, either individuals or communities, and so meaning the equal right of every person to effectively participate to collective decisions affecting himself or herself as individuals or communities. So democracy is not only a majority, democracy is a certain way of taking collective decisions. And the second is about AI. Yesterday we heard a lot of technical definition of AI. In my perception, I'm not a technician, as Deidre said, AI starts when we stop thinking about machines as mere tools acting on human command. It's nothing magical, but today large volumes of data allow machines to learn and to make very accurate predictions about the future, clearly surpassing human capacity. So actually, machines are not able, at least until now, to understand the causes of events, but they can predict them in a very accurate way. So this is my first point. There is a general misunderstanding, according to me, behind our constitutional approach to technological dilemmas, generally speaking, and AI democracy included. That is due to the classical moral, ethical, juridical framework that is the means-end relation. Within this framework, I'm over-approximating, there is always someone, a human being, usually, that is accountable for the means he or she uses. The well-known Aristotelian metaphor of the knife, a knife can be used to eat or to kill someone. Technique has no intrinsic value. It depends on its causal agent. And our constitutional mindset is obviously based on this principle. Think about a lot of important legal doctrine as proportionality, as reasonableness, as discretionality. They are framed within the idea of means-ends relation. With AI, the landscape changes and becomes more complicated, and so we have to change our legal and constitutional mindset to really understand it. And the point, in my view, has been raised a long time ago, more than 60 years ago, by a lot of what I call unheard prophets, because from Heidegger to Marcuse on, technology is, first of all, transforming our idea of causality, and therefore the classical means-end relations. Think about yesterday Ian's description of the agentic shift, or we heard about the role of non-deterministic algorithms to make predictions that we interpret as deterministic reasons. So anyway, today AI is not simply a tool to carry out previously taken decisions, but it's a way to take personal and collective decisions. So how does it happen? And I think in two dimensions. The first one, more direct, more visible, is when we explicitly ask technology to take decisions on our behalf, according to a sort of principal-agent relation. Think about when the Italian government utilized an algorithm to assign workplaces to new recruited school teachers, or the very famous Compass algorithm to assess the risk of possible offenders, or high-frequency trading software schemes, or robotics application as automated vehicles. And it's not the case, all legal hard cases. On the other hand, we have a second dimension in which there is this impact of AI on decision. Less visible, but probably more effective, is when AI affects our decision providing knowledge. Knowledge of reality is the basis for our personal and collective decisions, obviously not the only basis, but it's essential. And today we get more and more information in technology, and this mediation is not neutral. Think about information about politics, weather, sports, economics, health through the internet, or when we search something on Google and the way its algorithm provides the answers, or asking whatever on other kind of websites, or generally speaking, think about the increasing role of social media as information providers substituting other kind of medias. All again, hard cases. So AI deeply affects democracy. On one hand, taking collective decisions on our behalf, on the other, providing the knowledge for decisions. So how should we consider this relation? This is my final point. I agree with the idea of ambivalence of the technological paradigm, something that, as far as I understood correctly, recalls Ryan's affordance paradigm. That is to say, the relation between technology and democracy is not a linear one. Contemporary mythology, the more technology, the more democracy and freedom, could be misleading. My approach is borrowed somehow from environmental law studies, the idea of precautionary principle, to extend and transform it to a global precautionary constitutionalism. Today we are facing new technologies, and in a lot of cases we have no certainty if they can do harm or good, and sometimes we simply do not understand what are they doing. This fact cannot be a legitimate reason not to develop them, but also not to regulate them. We must ban technologies when we are sure that they are violating fundamental rights, but in most cases, we don't know it exactly. So for those cases, we have to imagine what I call a global regulation framework in order to keep those technologies within a margin of safety. Two examples. The first one is the connection between AI, tech, and economy, before were mentioned, what I call law and technomics. Today, only a few companies in the world have the data and the computation power to develop AI. Antitrust, on this I must be on a slightly different position with my colleagues for private law very often. Antitrust and free market policies alone are too weak instruments, as informed consent is too weak to protect our data in front of group privacy or big data mining. So Facebook on social media, Google as internet search, Amazon as e-commerce cloud provider, they simply have no competitors, or too few, or to say it better, as Zuckerberg did in front of Congress, China is the only competitor. So we must remember that in the beginning, it wasn't like that. All ICT technologies were open source, and here I think a role for public authorities has to be imagined. I see this recent proposal for a council regulation here in Europe on establishing a European high-performance computing joint undertaking. That could be an interesting. Second, what I call the practical force of AI. Let's imagine this new constitutional rule. Public decision affecting humans should be not taken only by AI. There must be always the right to a human intervention. As we all know, this is not so hypothetical because something similar has been introduced by the new GDPR. Well, on a precautionary constitutional basis, this rule is highly ineffective. It's extremely difficult to prove that an institution or a company took its decision only on the basis of an AI algorithm, or conversely, it's extremely easy to say that we took this decision on the basis of the algorithm, but not only. So if we see at the reality, AI, even if is not the exclusive decision maker, soon it will capture the decision. And not because of its speculative power or scientific justification, but because of its practical force. It's the nudging force of the default option. It exonerates the judge or policymakers from the burden of motivation. It seems more neutral. Look at terminology: evidence-based policymaking, knowledge-based system, data-driven, algorithmic government, and so on. This is the reason why in Italy, in these days, it could seem a democratic revolution that a decision taken by 100,000 people clicking on a web platform can bind the decision taken by a representative elected by millions of people. On contrary, we heard yesterday that there is an intrinsic bias in all predictive algorithms produced by the historical bias of the input. So how to remove, or at least to reduce, those input biases is another key point. And I think that this is the reason why, in conclusion, I think that AI can improve our democratic quality, but we have to imagine, as for the environment, some sort of global precautionary constitutional framework for this technology. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea, for that very clear presentation, and also for introducing that element into the debate. Now, you might think that there's a preponderance of lawyers on this panel, but in fact that isn't so. They just happen to come one after another, but there are only 3 out of 7. And for some reason, the women have as well been grouped at the end, but now I give the floor to Clara Raucher, who's here at the European University Institute as a Max Weber Fellow. She's from Austria originally, and she works on constitutional law, but in particular fundamental rights. So that will be probably a different approach.
Thank you. So we've heard about experiments of how, very interesting experiment of how opinions are formed in the online context. And we've also heard about the danger to democracy that artificial intelligence powered technologies can be used or misused to influence citizens and voters. And I'd like to, because I'm also speaking one of the last ones, focus on one very specific aspect of this, and that is how to regulate hate speech in an online environment and how the European Union regulates hate speech. This is also very interesting because there is an opportunity to use artificial intelligence there in a very positive way. So the term hate speech basically covers all forms of expression that spread, promote, or justify hatred based on intolerance. So, for example, xenophobia, anti-Semitism. And on the one hand, we know that a commitment to free speech is crucial for democracy and the working of democracy. And on the other hand, there is the danger that hate speech can distort political content and political sentiment. And that's particularly true, as we've heard already, for hate speech or speech in the online space. We all know of these so-called bots that are autonomous accounts that are disguised as human accounts on social media platforms that are used to shape the online debates and also to spread targeted hate speech to discredit politicians or certain groups of people and thereby to influence citizens and in particular voters. So I thought it might be interesting to have a look at what the European Union is doing about that. So EU Justice Commissioner Vera Jourova has said very recently that it's very unlikely, or is not likely, should get a bit closer. Yes. So Justice Commissioner Jourova has said it's very unlikely that she will regulate tech firms over hate speech. So instead, what she wants to do is to continue relying on a non-binding agreement that she made with Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, Microsoft, and Instagram and Google Plus and Snapchat have recently joined this non-binding agreement. And it's a voluntary code of conduct that exists since 2016. And the tech firms have basically agreed to help users notify illegal hate speech, to assess the majority of these user notifications within 24 hours, and then to remove information that can be classified as hate speech. This code of conduct is regularly evaluated by the European Commission, and the last evaluation was the third one in 2018, and the Commission found it's working really well and gave a very positive evaluation and said 70% of notifications are reviewed by the tech firms, and 80% are reviewed within the 24 hours. So the Commission basically said there's no need to do anything because it's working very well. So the first big limitation of this is obviously that it's not binding or enforceable. But what now even more so after all that I've learned about artificial intelligence over the course of yesterday and this panel also, is that it all relies on the notification by users. And then we know a lot of things are going on in the background, and users might not even be aware, and specifically because it specifically targeted certain groups of people to distort the political debate. Another problematic issue is, of course, that it's for the tech firms themselves to decide what qualifies as hate speech, and there are concerns about the effects that might have on free speech if too much content is removed. So we have a very similar debate in that regard than the debate about the right to be forgotten in the data protection law. So is too much removed, or should it be the tech firms to decide what is removed or what is not removed? In Germany, it has very recently enacted a new law, the so-called Netzwerkdurchsetzungsgesetz, quite a long term, but it's a lot of debate also on social media of that in Germany. And it's very similar to what the Commission is doing, but it's binding, and fines of up to tens of millions of euros can be the result if a tech firm is not deleting content or not deleting content within 24 hours of being reported. This law gets really heavy criticism from public lawyers in Germany, mainly for the reason that they say there are very heavy fines for not removing content, but there are no fines at all for removing too much content, and the decision on what to remove is on the tech firms. So the lawyers are saying that there's only an incentive to remove and not an incentive to check quite carefully what to remove and not what to remove. So to avoid fines, the incentive is to remove more than necessary. And then I'd like to conclude by just drawing your attention to a recent case that is pending before the European Court of Justice. It was sent by the Austrian Supreme Court, and it's about hate speech that concerns a female Austrian politician that was called all kinds of words I can't even translate into English in German. And so in the Austrian courts, all Austrian courts ruled that the insulting content has to be deleted. But now the question to the European Court of Justice is, does the content have to be deleted only in Austria or globally on social media? And then the even more interesting question is, does only this specific formulation of the content has to be removed, or is it for Facebook in that context to find all kind of similar content and to automatically remove it also in the future? So that's the question that we will hear from the European Court of Justice on that, whether there's a global obligation to remove hate speech, not just for a specific member state. And because there is not much EU legislation on that, it's mainly the Austrian Supreme Court is mainly referring to the e-commerce directive to as a legal basis for its questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clara, and for also introducing the legal component and the role of courts, but in particular also the European Court and perhaps its ambitions or the implications of its judgments beyond Europe, so globally. Our final panelist is Kate Clonink, who's also, I believe, a practicing lawyer, but also a legal scholar associated with Yale. So you have the floor.
Thank you. Definitely not practicing, but definitely a lawyer. So I'm going to pick up actually where, and I apologize if I pronounce your name, Mr. Kuzimski kind of talked about with the socio-technological framework. And I'm going to keep these really short because I'd love for us to have a bit of a Q&A and have that happen. So, but I'm just going to propose that really one of the things that we're talking about, and I think that Clara really highlighted with what she was discussing in her hate speech example, is that when we talk about AI and democracy, we have to change entirely the perspectives and the way that we've imagined governance works anymore. And when I say that, I guess I'm talking about something that Jack Balkin talks about in his most recent paper, which is that there, for centuries, for millennia, there have been this model of governance that is very much a dyadic model. It's between people and the nation state, and it's really about asserting rights back against the nation state to keep the boot off the neck of the people. And then you have, of course, the nation state trying to basically have legitimacy and accountability to the people. And operating within that, of course, are private private companies. And for a long time, those companies have also happened to be transnational. But I think that what's happening now with technology that's never happened before is that transnational companies are now become so expansive, and they have become so ever-present in dictating and governing basic human rights of people online, from speech to democracy to access to knowledge and all of these other kinds of ideas, that they exist in a new kind of triadic model, a new power dynamic that is between these transnational private companies, traditional nation states, and the people. And the real problem with that triadic model right now is that, and the problem that I think we're discussing when we talk about AI and democracy, is that we do not have and have not established a reliable and direct way to have the people and those transnational companies be in dialogue and conversation. And that is, I think, a lot of kind of what we have to figure out and what we have to talk about, because as we talk about how this AI happens, this AI and these algorithms, those are being controlled by what I would call kind of our new governors, these transnational companies that control our rights. And we can build an idea of accountability that takes into account due process and free speech and all of these other ideas. But do we want it to be through regulation by the nation states? Do we want it to be directly between individuals and individuals in those companies? I think Claire raises a lot of issues in the right to be forgotten cases that are happening in the European courts, as well as the hate speech cases that were just taken by the European court, that those are the ideas that they're basically struggling with. And so to highlight one quick example, it might seem really easy to have kind of a direct democracy approach of why don't we just let people vote? It's highly efficient to vote online. There might be problems with fraud, but let's say we get rid of those problems. Let's kind of establish this. And I kind of want to bring up the idea of how these platforms and technology companies can control our elections without even allowing them to use them to directly vote. And that's after the 2016 election, a lot of the, actually it was the 2012 election, that Facebook acknowledged that they could control basically who came to turn out for voting based on what they showed you socially about how much your friends had voted. And so that was this very, very simple cognitive, psychological, socio-principle that they had manipulated and had drastically altered a very real-world event of voter turnout. In contrast, I want to tell you another story, which is the story of back in like 2009, when Facebook actually was briefly a direct democracy. They opened their privacy policies and some of their hate speech policies up for a brief period of time following a controversy to have people vote on them and be to basically determine exactly what their privacy policies were. And guess how many people voted? 563,000. That was 0.03% of the 200 million active users on Facebook. So I think the LA Times called it the moment that that Facebook gave us a big homework assignment that no one wanted to do. So I think that this is kind of I'm just going to put those two kind of points out there to kind of highlight some problems and some issues in kind of instrumentalizing the ideas of democracy in this new framework of kind of the triadic model. And 10 whole minutes. Okay, great.
Thank you, Kate, for introducing that dimension. So we have a lot on our plate, I think it can fairly be said, but we can go a little bit over time, but not too much, because we don't want to eat into Katie's keynote address and coffee after that. But we have some time, so we should feel that because there's a lot on the table, this is also the moment for exchange across the disciplines on the specific issue of the relationship between AI and democracy, and also the US and America. Again, Kate, in Europe, if you say you're a lawyer, then people will assume you're a practicing lawyer, so apologies, but in Europe, native English speakers will assume you're a practicing lawyer. So that's, so let's immediately go into the debate. So I'll give the floor to, or you can respond to one another. You're perhaps overwhelmed by the amount of things that are on the table. So, not seeing you again, Ryan.
No, I'm sorry, I'm not shy. I only jump in if I don't see other people that want to jump in. But so my question has to do with this idea of using simple rules to manipulate, the outcomes in terms of convergence, right? And I guess what my main question about that has to do with the salience of the belief that's held. I'm sorry. So my main question about the experiment has to do with the salience of the belief held. Right? So for example, if one set of people in the model, they're just trying to figure out, who has better, tortellini a ragu. You know what I mean? Is it this restaurant or this restaurant? I could imagine it would play out that way. But if it's something with a high degree of salience, like for example, whether abortion is murder, no amount of mixing them around or changing the algorithm is going to change anybody's views. Right? I mean, that just is not the case. And so I wonder to what degree does how vehemently you hold a belief affect that calculus? Because that seems to me like it would really drive the experiment in different directions.
Yeah, of course, this is a good point. The point of my example, your discussion, is that we've been concentrating a lot on increasing, let's say, the matching among people, essentially driven by profit. I mean, if a platform is driven by the idea of making very good advertising, right, you actually want to put like-minded people into contact because this will optimize your strategy, right? What I'm saying is that the same strategy is not good, it's far from optimal if you want to spread ideas and put people into let's say, better ways of getting confronted with different narratives about any aspect. And the point is that we have concentrated very little how to do that, I agree with you that simply putting together two completely opposing views probably would not work in many practical situations. But we know from social networking, not only theory but practice, that there are things like the bridges, the weak ties that put into connections people that are across different communities and can actually act as mediators among different views of the world. And we might begin to harness the power of networks for reducing polarity and polarization rather than increasing it. It can be, it's difficult, but it's like as difficult as putting people together. So what I mean is that we need to concentrate more on understanding what are the social mechanisms that would facilitate confrontation with different ideas. This does not necessarily mean to put you into contact with a totally opposing view, but you could make ties on, bringing you to see things from a slightly different point of view that would increase your curiosity, maybe, to look at some controversial issue along a different view. And this is not only a matter of online conversation, but it's also about media in general. I think this is a kind of, let's say, objective we should somehow care very much about, because more and more we are in one effect of AI and data science and machine learning is personalization, the ability of really understanding individual needs, right? And the individual needs are not only somehow to reinforce the bias of the person, no? But could be also to open to some extent the possibilities and provide different views, different possibilities in a way which is functional, not only to advertising, not only to selling, but also to improving the well-being of people. And this, I mean, it's something we could begin to harness.
Thank you. Did you want to come here?
Just to make just a short comment. So it seems to me that we have been addressing a kind of two converging issues in this discussion. On the one hand, we had the issue that was introduced by Alex, how to use AI to substitute basically the usual political process in order to take political decisions. And then we had the other issue that emerged in various speeches on how to influence, how to adapt the current ways in which AI is used, in particular by private companies, to inject some political values into this kind of ways in which currently AI is deployed. I was wondering, on the first point, whether we really think that AI can be used in order to take political decisions, and on the second, substituting the democratic process as we understand it now, and on the second point, how do you think that we can really inject public values into the ways in which private companies are now managing their websites and their infrastructures? That is where the maximizing profit is the obvious main motivation.
Is that addressed to Professor Pedretti?
Yes.
Yeah. I think it's addressed to you. Yes. Yeah, if you have any views on it, and then we'll continue. So, yeah. You can just...
In a sense, very briefly, this is precisely the point I wanted to make. You know, the point is that we really need to care a lot about, since more and more people is actually accessing information through social media sites, this platform are getting a much larger social responsibility for what they do. And the point is that I really believe it's also somehow scientifically founded, the fact that the goal of maximizing profit and the goal of maximizing opinion diversity are, they don't match up very well. They actually are aiming at quite opposite goals, and therefore we have an issue there. I don't think that an advertising platform like Facebook can be the place where the political discourse and the opinion can actually go, because these are two fundamentally conflicting goals. That's my point.
Okay, thank you. I have 4 people now on my list, and I think I'll probably close it then in the interest of not getting too far behind time and making Katie wait too much. So first, Mr. Van Rompuy, you were first.
Thank you very much. I have a question for Professor Simoncini, and that touches also on the question of networks. You were saying that right now administrations don't have the capacity to prove that a decision was made only by an AI, even if it were. And that reminds me the questions that have been raised in the debate on autonomous weapon systems, where they bring concepts like meaningful human control. And when you look at the reality of the technology in the military sector, what happens is that you have a whole network of machines that are connected to one another and that interact in a way that is not necessarily decipherable by human beings, and that shape the types of decisions that can be made by the human being. So in the end, even if you have a killer robot that's directly controlled by a human being, and that you have this human operator that press the shooting target, effectively its their decision is constrained by invisible forces. And so my question is only made by an AI, isn't that already insufficient?
Okay, I'll let you come back in later on that. So Bert-Jan Koops, you were next.
Yes, I wanted to follow up on the role of platform providers in providing pluriformity of media and news, because I think that diversity is one of the general values that has come up in the discussion. I briefly discussed diversity yesterday with Nathalie Hellberger, who researches the question, what is diversity in media? My simple answer was, if it's more than one, then you have diversity. Following up on the theme of the whole conference on comparative approaches, it strikes me that there might be a difference between bipartisan systems. So the United States, the UK have generally 2 parties, and you would imagine that diversity there would mean at least 2 types of opinions, whereas other countries have a far larger spectrum of political. We now have, I think, 14 parties represented in Dutch Parliament. So the diversity there would probably mean more than 13. So what does that mean for platform providers? Do they have to have culture-specific or nation-specific interpretations of diversity? And if so, what does that tell them about how to implement AI?
If I may take on this also, what I can tell you from the point of view of my research, my studies, and many other people, is that it's not really how much diversity you need. We only observe that the higher diversity you observe in a political conversation, or simply in practical aspects like mobility, in the activity of people. We have plenty of studies around the world that show that the diversity of movement of people is linked to better well-being, to better outcome at societal level. And similarly, at the level of opinion, there are plenty of examples in many different fields that show that if there is a genuine and naive, let's say, diversity in opinion of the weight of a cow, the crowd altogether will be a better median closer to the actual weight of the cow. And this has been somehow really shown over and over again in many circumstances. It's not a matter of how much diversity you need, but certainly it is true, and many computational social scientists have shown that if you put strong influence in a crowd that reduces the diversity, the ability of the crowd of solving a problem diminishes and gets worse. So it's a correlation story. I can't really answer how much diversity you need, but I know that more diversity is better.
Thank you. Margot Kaminsky.
So this was fascinating, and I'm basically echoing a conversation that was playing out on Twitter as this was happening. So it seems to me that Alex's comments about the AI as a substitute for voter offended a number of people's sensibilities, probably my own included, because we think of a voter in a democracy as something far more than preferences, right? A voter is a moral agent or an autonomous agent, and we want that voter to be constructed as a moral or an autonomous agent. And democracy is really about both constructing what that individual voter is and how that individual voter relates to the state and the power of the state. So that's thanks to both Andrea and Kate for making that point. The more interesting and relevant question then, as Kate was saying, is not do we use AI to directly substitute one for the voter? It's at what point does the role that AI is playing in these transnational private party intermediaries move from being the traditional role of media, which accentuates a voter's agency, into being something that substitutes for a voter's agency and effectively makes those transnational parties the operators of our democratic system. So that is a question in the posing of a statement. Is that roughly what has emerged from this panel?
Andrea, do you want to answer that?
Yeah. Well, first I'd like to answer to Leonard's point quickly. Probably I wasn't so clear, but we agree. I mean, my point was exactly this, that as soon as you have some sort of AI technology within the loop of decision, it tends to capture the final decision, even if it's not the only tool. Even if you can say, well, there is also a human intervention. It is because of what I call the practical force of those, the default option. So the fact that if we have something that could provide us motivations, we simply stick on them and we simply follow this because it's easier, because we save time, and also we have a sort of technical scientific basis to say. So, for example, the GDPR regulation that points this new rights in the EU law, saying all the decisions that can affect, in automated decisions that can affect individual persons, cannot taken only by AI. I think it's quite ineffective, because at the end of the day, there's this force. And the second, well, I try to answer quickly the two questions of Giovanni, but the first one, I simply agree totally with Margot, what said, because I have the same feeling. So I think that AI cannot substitute democracy for the simple thing that we are not speaking only about preferences. But I'm really most intrigued by the second point, that was raised by also Kate. How can we insert I mean, our worries about human rights protection or whatever within this sort of transnational private use of AI. Well, here I have two questions, two possible answers. The first one is the difference, and this is interesting because it's a comparative dialogue, the difference between two constitutional systems. Because in your constitutional system, constitutional principles apply mainly for the state, not private entities. While in our constitutional system, constitution is binding for all citizens, private company included. So if we can start from this idea that there is a constitutional value of, for example, the motivation of all the decisions affecting the freedom, and for example, in Italian constitution we have such kind of principle, we can say that also companies has to stick. But the second one, perhaps is more interesting also for the place we are. If we follow the image, you know, the line, the dynamic of GDPR or the privacy. Now we started from privacy by regulation, then privacy by design, privacy by default. Well, I think that something has to happen with another step that is what we can call, what we can call privacy by education. That means that one important field is how we educate, how we train people that works in those fields. I think that this is another key point, because we have no way, as famous line, that no other way to make internet a better place if we do not make better internet users. So I think we have to pass through people that is working. So here the role of education, of universities, of this kind of multidisciplinary dialogues, because this is really crucial. I think there are always someone that is doing this kind of work, and I think that this kind of, I mean, we have new tools. When I talk about margin of safety, I think I'm thinking exactly this, about a mix of different kind of rules, not only public enforceable rules, but also soft laws, and also all the normative spectrum that we can use.
Thank you, Andrea. I think there could actually be no better way of ending this panel. We've had various views also transatlantically and across the disciplines, but we're under severe time constraints. No, this panel has been really good. I mean, 10 minutes over time is perfect, but there are some other issues in terms of people who have to leave and stuff. So I hand back over to Giovanni, and thank you all very much warmly for what I think has been an excellent discussion. We haven't resolved, I think, anything, but we, I think, have increased our understanding and put a number of important issues in a clear manner on the table. So thank you all very much.
Thank you very much to all the panelists, and in particular to Deidre for so skillfully managing this panel, but so much has been said. I would like now to move to the next. First of all, I would announce a small change in our program since Clementina has to leave. So after Kathy's presentation, we are going to have Clementina's, and which means that the coffee break is going to shift of a quarter of an hour. Now I'm very, very happy and honored to introduce Kate Atkinson. Kate Atkinson is a professor of computer science and head of Department of Computing Science at the University of Liverpool. She has been working in the domain of artificial intelligence and law, focusing on particular on issues such as argumentation and justification of decisions, intelligent tools for legal reasoning and law companies. I've been in contact, a friend of Katie for many years, because we are working in the same domain, the area of artificial intelligence and law. Kate has also been the president of the International Association for Artificial Intelligence and Law, and chairing the main conference in this domain. So nobody better than Katie could present the topic of a speech, which is reflection on the current and future impact of artificial intelligence on the legal profession. So I'm very happy to give the floor now to Katie. Thanks for being with us.
So thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk today in this beautiful setting. I feel like by being here today, I'm symbolically pledging my allegiance to Europe, given that I'm not in the UK watching the royal wedding that's going on there today. So thank you for having me here. Talk about referendums. I'm feeling the result of the momentous referendum that happened in the UK recently, and I could spend half an hour talking about that, but I'm not sure that I could say anything that hasn't already been said over the past 2 years, so I'll keep away from the topic of Brexit. So as Giovanni said, my own research has been about computational models of argument, how we model the process of argumentation, and how we can embody that in automated AI reasoning systems. So my PhD was on the topic of this, and it also specifically looked at value-based reasoning and how we can model value-based reasoning in automated argumentation. I wasn't the first working on this. I've followed in the footsteps of other people. Giovanni was working on this before I was, and it's a very relevant topic for law, and I think even more so nowadays from the conversations that we've seen this morning and yesterday. But I'm not going to talk about Brexit. I'm not going to talk about my own research. What I am going to do is try to give an overview of what's been going on in the academic AI and law community over the past couple of years whilst I was president. So I'll give some summaries of some current developments from research that has gone on in the AI and law community that has been running for a long time. And then I'll talk about some recent collaborative work that has been gaining some momentum between researchers and legal practitioners. And then I'll try and do a little bit of horizon scanning by looking at upcoming topics and challenges that I see from the recent conversations that have been going on there. Okay, so it seems not only does everybody want a slice of the AI pie at the moment, but there's parties going on all over the place in AI and law. So there's been a lot of media interest, there's been a lot of interest from the law firms, and when law firms contact me and say, we want to get a piece of this AI pie, they're often quite surprised to hear just how long research on AI and law, not just AI, but specifically AI and law, has actually been going on. So I started publishing in this field in 2003, but it had been going on for decades before that. The very first international conference on AI and law was held in 1987 in Boston. I wasn't there, but people who were there in the 80s tell me it looked something like this. So that's when, I assume that's what all 80s parties look like. That's when the party officially started, and it was people, like-minded people who were interested in looking at AI specifically for legal problems. So then, as this group of people came together more frequently, it became cemented, and then the International Association for AI and Law that was constituted in 1992 with the explicit aim of supporting the AI and law community and running the biennial international conference on AI and law that has run ever since 1987. Okay, so we fast forward to where we are now, and the past 8 years have seen the emergence of what we now refer to as the legal tech scene, and it's got a much more commercial focus, but that's not to say that the research from the academic AI and law community doesn't still have relevance, even though everybody's got in on this party. So the research itself, so not just the technology, but the underlying ideas, has started receiving increased media attention. So there are all these magazines aimed at kind of the end users who are trying to educate people about AI. We've seen the newspapers picking up on this, so an AI judge being developed, or radio programs that a number of people here have featured on as well. But we're trying to bring this research to the masses a little bit more. We've all seen those headlines about the automation of jobs as well. So it's not just general AI being applied to law. There is this community that has been doing research on AI specifically for law. But then, of course, you've got your big success stories, so your IBM Watsons. So we've seen the application of that in the legal space. So the Ross Intelligence in Canada looking at using IBM's Watson's technology in the legal space. And then I've also seen murmurs about the techniques that DeepMind were using on AlphaGo and trying to apply that into other areas. So there's general AI being applied in law, and then there's all this research that has been going on AI specifically for law. So how can we get a handle on all this and try and bring it all together to make developments has been something that we've been trying to get the community to think about. Then we've got this whole other space, so we've got these commercial products that have just exploded onto the market in the last few years, now making use of AI, so that they're now much more established and much more widespread. In March this year, I was at the British Legal Technology Forum, giving a talk there, and I was at that 2 years before, and they have all the vendors who have their stalls there set out telling people about their products, and the number just over the 2 years had just increased massively. And from what I'm hearing from the people in the law firms who I'm speaking to, there's just this sea of products now, and people find it very difficult to navigate through this sea and find out, okay, which ones are actually going to solve my problems? Is it worth investing in this? Do we go with the commercial vendors? Do we develop something in-house? And how do I know that what's under the hood actually is AI? So there's a lot of people badging what they do as AI, and if we can't have that scrutability to see what's under there, and then that causes nervousness as well. So I've just, I could have filled this entire slide with photos and logos from all these companies, but I've just picked on 3 because we had these 3 come and give some demos at an event that was with the last International Conference on AI and Law that I will say a little bit more about later on. So these 3 are in very different spaces. So Kira Systems is a machine learning tool, so you can use it to pick out the important concepts from contracts. So based on machine learning ideas. Neotologic is of a very different flavor. It's more of the traditional expert systems kind of tool, and this speaks to the talk that we heard yesterday, where we've got the new AI and the old AI approaches, and I think in the AI space in general, there's a lot of tribalism going on there at the moment about which is best and why. So we've tried to do something to bring these parties more together. So I think it's not just the general public who might need persuading about the benefits of other techniques, but it's also the researchers themselves. There isn't a one-size-fits-all, one technique is best for solving all problems. So we had them come, Kira and Yota, and give some demos at a workshop that we had as part of the conference last year. And then there's also Brainspace, who are more in the e-discovery space. So just looking at their website this morning, I see that they describe themselves as the fastest and most powerful weapon for conducting digital investigations. So there's a regulation about weapons for digital investigations that raises. Okay, so as I said, you go to these legal tech conferences, and there's rows and rows of these vendors selling their products. But then there's also been a number of in-house developments that we've seen emerge as well, in addition to these bought-in technologies. I had a project with a company in the northwest of England called Riverview Law, and they have been looking at developing their own solutions that they're now looking to license to other people. Kim Technologies is what they use. Pinsent Masons, so they've got their own AI stuff going on. That's just a screenshot from their website, how they're bringing AI to life. And then we've got Next Law Labs. So they say that they were the first legal technology venture that was created by a law firm, and they aim to be a leading global legal innovation consultancy. So we've actually now got these companies coming out of the law firms, and the innovation is happening in there, as well as in academia, and as well as in the companies who are developing the products, but not necessarily in conjunction with the law firms. So there's these sea of options for people to navigate and try and work out which option is best for them and why. So there's been efforts to try and map out the space of legal tech companies who are out there. So I took this screenshot this morning. So I've done that before when I've given these talks. I've taken a screenshot, and the numbers have even changed by the time I've taken the screenshot and presented it to the audience. But about 2 hours ago, there were 854 companies who were listed on the Codex Tech Index. So that's the Stanford Codex Center for legal informatics, and they do a nice classification of the companies that they've got in their tech list, and there's all sorts of legal tasks that are covered by that list, and I think that can be of some help for people who are trying to navigate this space and see what options there are out there. So specifically in the UK, so Legal Geek produced this map. I think it's intended to look like the London Underground system, so you can try and see the different tracks that there are on different topics. That might well have changed since I first took that from their website as well. So we can see that there's lots of startup activity going on in the UK. The US was well ahead previously, but we're now starting to see this in the UK and also across Europe, and you can just go and look those up yourselves on those websites. Okay, so everybody's got in on this party. That's great. The AI and law community, since I have been interacting with it, has spent a lot of time in the early days worrying about how to expand. I went to numerous conferences where the presidents gave talks and said, there's so many computer scientists in the room. Why aren't all the lawyers coming here? Why aren't people interested in taking up our research? What can we do to expand the community? And then all of a sudden there's been this explosion in the last couple of years, which is a good thing, but now there's all these problems that we've been talking about the last 2 days. So the ICAIL conference used to be one of very few on this topic, and now we can't move for all the different conferences that there are. Some are more academic facing, some are more industry facing, some are trying to merge the two. And just a little bit of advertising. So the 2019 version of the ICAIL conference will be going to the Cyber Justice Laboratory at the University of Montreal in June 2019. Okay, so at the conference last year that took place in London, so there was a lot of people that were talking about the hype. So we had the media there. There hadn't been much media coming to the conferences in the past. There were people giving interviews in the corridors. There were the law firms there, making sure that they weren't missing out. And there's some consternation about the amount of hype that there is in the field right now, and how we can manage to keep things grounded, because we don't want the bubble to burst, and we don't want there to be expectations and they're not being met. Of course, the researchers want their research to be seen and to be used, but we also don't want to make false promises that will take away the interest and also the potential funding for developing this research. So this is Gartner's hype cycle. I don't think they've got a 2018 version out just yet, but what they show there, as you might not be able to see it very clearly up there. So we've got the innovation triggers at the start, and then we've got the peak of inflated expectations, and you will see right up there at the top of the peak of inflated expectations is deep learning. So that's hopefully coming down the other side. Apparently, according to Gartner, it has to go through the trough of disillusionment, first of all, and then hopefully it will come out into a plateau of productivity. So you can see how they came up with that at that link. So virtual reality speeding ahead there nicely into the lead. So we hope that the hype doesn't harm the actual research that is going on and the take-up of it. So I said that the community has been wanting people to take up this research and to make use of it. There are early examples of this. So there was a paper published in 1991 about legislative knowledge-based systems, specifically for public administration. And the authors of that paper looked at some practical issues, and then that work was taken forward into the commercial sector. It went through SoftLaw, then Haley Systems, Ruleburst, and then was eventually bought up by Oracle, and that is now incorporated under Oracle's policy automation. So we do have experience of doing this, but it wasn't as prevalent as it is now. So I've just picked out a few topics from the IKL conference that took place last year, just to show what people in this community have been working on. So these are the titles of a number of papers. The first one was a paper that I co-authored with Riverview Law. I said we've been working with them on a project, and this was about information extraction from commercial law documents and new methods to try and get context into that. So there's a very wide range of topics that was covered by the program of the conference, so towards a legal definition of machine intelligence, so this issue of artificial personhood, and this was specifically for the age of deep learning. There was a number of papers on machine learning topics. There was one looking at early predictability of asylum court decisions using a data-driven approach. There's a very large e-discovery community. They have their own workshop that's co-located with the conference, but one of the papers in the main conference was looking at the effectiveness of popular e-discovery algorithms. Then there was a more regulation one, so looking at autonomous vehicles and making them respect traffic law. That was by a Dutch group. And then there was also a paper on GDPR, AI-supported decision-making under GDPR. So you can see there's a whole plethora of topics that are covered there. So the regulation, what it means, how we categorize AI, the machine learning ones, and there's also the more traditional approaches, the kind of rule-based approaches. And also there's a big argumentation community, which is where my own research sits, as I mentioned previously. So this conference has been going on biennially since 1987, but to try and get a bit more joined up thinking and react to the external environment, I co-organized a workshop that was co-located with this conference, and it was the first workshop on AI and legal practice. I organised this with Jerome Keppens, who works in the AI and law community. He's at King's College London in the informatics department, and also Nick West from Mishkundireya. And the aim was to try and take everything that's been going on in this space and bridge the gap between legal professionals and AI and law researchers to make sure that everybody knew what each was doing, and also so that we could hear about each other's problems and try and get some joined up community thinking. So we had a number of different presentations. We had those 3 companies that I mentioned before give demos of their products. And we also ended with a more open debate session to try and thrash out what the issues and the barriers were to these different communities coming together. And here's a summary of the outcomes from that debate. So this characterized, this phrase here came out that characterized a lot of the talk. So fixing the piping before thinking about the magic. There were a number of people from law firms who said, I'd love to do something about AI, but we can't even get our document processing systems to work. The IT department can't fix these issues that are causing all sorts of bureaucracy. So it would be great if we could first get efficient systems and then look at how we would get AI products, because there's often also the issue of integrating the AI products into the existing customer relationship management systems. And that's part of the debate about, do we do something in-house that we've got control about and we can integrate easily, or if we buy something in, then we've got to expand the IT team to try and integrate those solutions into what we're doing. So that was a key topic that came out. Here's a list of other topics as well. So there was the issue of public engagement, so academics not speaking in academic language, whether it be legal language, whether it be computing jargon, but trying to develop a shared language so that the relevant parties aren't frightened off from each other. IP issues came up. There were a number of people who had tried to start collaborations between academics and between law companies, but then there were wranglings over who owns the IP and the end product. Obviously, the companies want to make money of this, but the academics don't just want to be doing this for free as well. A big issue that the community has talked about is the lack of shared data sets. So we have people working on their own data sets, and if we could try these different techniques on the same data sets, we can see which techniques work, what they're missing, and whether they can learn from each other about putting heads together. So we've seen all these headlines. There was also concern about competition driving up that hype and driving up the expectations as well. So nobody wants to be left behind. Everybody wants a piece of that AI pie. As soon as a new partnership is started up, as soon as there's a new innovation coming out, it goes straight to the PR department. They write their lovely piece about AI is being used. You know, AI is coming. It makes everybody else worried that they're getting left behind and they have to get in it as well. And then we've just got those expectations being ramped up as well. So there was concern about that. Open source software, that's already been mentioned this morning. So something that other previous presidents of the association have talked about is the need to focus on the tasks of your end users. So it's no good the academic community saying, well, we're all doing this great research. Why is nobody picking this up? Is it solving the problems of the law firms? So it's no good saying, you take that research paper away, you read it, and then we'll talk about how we can apply that. We need to be able to say, okay, you know, not just use the AI magic brush, but say, okay, what particular problem is it that you're trying to solve? Is it indeed that you need an AI solution for this, and how do we actually go about bringing that about? And we also talked about the lack of collective thought with all these different interests between these different stakeholders and the need to try and bring some more community thinking about that. So here are some questions that the community has been considering as part of that conference and since then. So how do we actually try and establish these collaborative links between these different stakeholders who have got their own values, who have got their own interests, but we need to try and align those. There are a number of success stories emerging from these collaborations, but plenty of problems remain unsolved, like that list that I just mentioned previously. And we re-emphasize this need to be task-focused and flexible, but quite often academics can just work on their own little problems that they're interested in, and it might even be the case that research that's being produced nowadays, it's not immediately obvious what benefit it will have to society until years down the line, and there's plenty of examples of that happening previously. So this the legal tech space is getting very crowded now. With everybody getting in on this, but the community wants us to also make sure that there's prominence given to blue sky research. That remains important, even if we can't necessarily see the immediate applications as the research is developed. So we want to make sure that we remain focused on that blue sky research as well as the application of established techniques. And we also talked about the need to engage on wider issues around AI and law. So I mentioned that there's all these companies who have got their products, and it's not always entirely clear how much AI there actually is. So a key cornerstone of the academic community is the importance that we place upon evaluation activities, and this is something that I've emphasized to the law firms who we've been working with. So what evidence do you have that, that these techniques, when they're being applied, they work, they don't violate any regulations, they're aligned with the values of society, they're aligned with the company's values as well, so that we don't just take it as carte blanche that these products are going to be great, all singing and all dancing, and solve all problems. So we need to know that they have been thoroughly and properly evaluated, and that those evaluations are open for scrutiny. So, further issues in addition to solving those task-based problems. So particularly over the last year or so, the law firms who I've been speaking to have been saying not only they, but their clients are now demanding that we address this black box issue. So they're not comfortable turning around to their clients and saying, yep, we've got, a computer says some particular decision and we can't interrogate why. So this relates back to the issue we talked about yesterday about accountability. We should always be able to ask why and justify why this decision was made to the same level that we would expect a human to give if we were saying to a human, tell me why you have reached that particular conclusion and not some other conclusion. So there's also concerns about the legal implications of the legal AI systems themselves. So I've had a number of debates with people, particularly with legal philosophers about whether predictions that are coming out of the AI systems are satisfying correct legal reasoning. So there's the issue of who gets to say what is actually correct. So in my own research, we've done some evaluation activities on domains of case law, and we've looked at whether the decisions that our AI tools come up with match what the humans came up with, but humans are also infallible as well, and there's also debates between legal scholars as to whether the correct decision is always made in the first place by the human. Last year, I was on a panel at a legal tech conference, and they asked us to make predictions about what was coming in the next 5 years, and somebody sat next to me on the panel said that he thought that in 5 years' time that there would be a legal case where somebody was being sued for not using the recommendations of the AI system and instead relying upon humans who have been shown to make bad and incorrect decisions. And I don't know if that was just looking for some headline grabbing to stimulate some debate, but there's also the issue of garbage in, garbage out in computer science terms. Your output is only as good as what you put into it, and we need to make sure that we've got checks on the outcomes. Privacy concerns as well, there's been enough said about that I don't need to go into detail about that. Also the wider societal issues. Is society ready to allow AI systems to make legal decisions? I already mentioned the reliability of human decision-making versus machine decision-making. So studies are often done on how often the legal practitioners themselves have won a certain number of cases. If your AI tool can then show that it's correctly predicted more cases than the humans are using, then there becomes the impetus to ask how much should we rely on the machine versus the human. So this next point goes back to a little bit more about what Ryan was saying yesterday about doing things differently. Don't necessarily assume that all the old ways have to continue. So in 2015, there was a report written that was led by Richard Susskind on looking at online courts. There was a recommendation that was made in the UK to establish a new internet-based court service known as Her Majesty's Online Courts, and that was looking at the kind of eBay model of dispute resolution, and that has specifically been aligned with the value of access to justice. So it's just taking too long to get a lot of these cases seen and have their day in court. So this was specifically looking at civil claims that were under 25,000 and looking at if there was any way that we could try and resolve and speed up access to justice by going through the online courts instead. So that was a summary of a lot of the conversations that have been going on in the AI and law community over the past couple of years. Here are a few final reflections of my own. So research from AI and law is making more of an impact on industry than any time that I've known since I've been working in this field. There's a lot of hype, but there are real-world solutions that we're starting to see emerging from that, and it's very important that they get documented and evaluated, like I already said. Another driver is external funding bodies, particularly in the UK. We've got a government drive on this. We have something called the Research Excellence Framework that happens every 6 years. It last happened in 2014. It's coming up again in 2021. And this is the government's way of evaluating the research that goes on in every single department of every single university in the UK. And they look at publications, they look at your environment, how much grant income you get, how many PhD students you graduate, but they also now look at impact. So funding bodies want to know that the money that they're putting into research in the UK is not just going to stay in the universities, but it's actually going to get out there into society and have some benefits. So we're being evaluated on that now, and that's specifically trying to open up more collaboration between academics and wider users. There is more joined up thinking going on now, I think, between different groups of stakeholders. Another example from the UK, so 2 weeks ago, there was an initiative announced that University of Liverpool is involved with UCL London, a number of Magic Circle law firms, and also the Law Society of England and Wales. So Barclays has been leading on this. They have these Eagle Labs, their innovation spaces, and they've just announced that they have one of these labs that's going to be dedicated to law tech in London, and that's going to be an incubator space to try and get lots of different people coming together and sharing expertise, giving access to the academics, to the legal experts, and also supporting the startup companies themselves. And that's just one example of many initiatives that are going on. But from my own perspective, I feel that there's still a long way to go on this journey. So research and development money is flowing into AI and its application areas. So we see that in lots of different nation states. In Europe, everybody's announcing their AI strategies. France recently had their announcement. The UK have had theirs. There's the European one, the European strategy that we heard yesterday. But in the rush to get the money in the rush to get the research out, there needs to be consideration as well to the regulation issues that we've been talking about the last 2 days, and also the auditing issues, and I think they need to be built into these considerations as well. Don't just rush your AI products out, but think about whether these are actually meeting the values that society wants. So something else that has been of concern to me is education programs in universities. They need to react to the changing landscape as well. I think the US is ahead of the UK on this. I know there are initiatives in other European countries. There are a few examples in the UK of these more legal tech courses that are coming out now, but there's still an awful lot of law schools who are still just teaching the traditional routes and the traditional ways, and aren't necessarily thinking about the changes that are coming in the legal sector and whether they're properly preparing their graduates for those changes and the jobs that will be going and the jobs that will also be coming. So thank you very much for having me here to give these reflections. I've done a number of collaborations with people in the AI and law community, so there's some academic collaborators there as well as some of the legal partners with who I collaborate. If you're interested in finding out more about the International Association for AI and Law, please see our website. You're welcome to join our AI and Law LinkedIn group as well, and there's more information that can just be found about the conference that I mentioned from 2017 by Googling ICAL. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.
So great, thank you very much, Katie, for this broad and informed and also stimulating presentation about AI and law. Just one point I would like to add, another source of information is the Artificial Intelligence and Law Journal, which is also the journal of the Association of Artificial Intelligence and Law, and you can find it online quite easily. So I'm very happy to to get any question you may have about this area of development of research in law and AI, which really merges in an interdisciplinary effort the two communities. Please, Andrea.
Quick questions. The first one is this, because you have your viewpoint is at the International Association of this. So I was wondering if you spoke a lot, mainly about UK or this kind of environment. I was wondering if those kind of legal tech developments are the same for common law systems and civil law systems. So what's going on continental Europe? Perhaps Giuseppe can answer this. So if there is a similar expansion of this kind of endeavors, but in context in which the president, the courts has totally different roles and legislation is completely different. Second question I have, because we are involved in a specific project here in Florence on this. You speak mainly about themes or tasks connected to litigation or to private law firms. Anything about ADRs, alternative dispute resolution, so the use of, for example, mediation or alternative kind of conflict resolution, arbitration. So there is a similar evolution also in other legal fields that are enlarging that are not simply a judicial decision.
Okay, thank you. So in answer to your first question, so yes, there's huge input into the community, not just from the UK and Europe, but also Europe-wide, and looking at the different issues that are aligned with different legal systems as well. So if you look through the proceedings of the AI and Law Conference, you will see that there's all sorts of projects going on. In terms of the legal tech scene itself and the companies, whether they're addressing the needs of those different jurisdictions. So I've been to these legal tech conferences in Europe, and again, they're very much focused on the tasks rather than saying, you know, we've got an AI one size fits all. So I think you have to really navigate and look at the task for the particular legal system that you're working in, and seeing which particular pieces of software and tools are out there to address those tasks. But certainly, there is definitely wide coverage. I know there's a number of startups in France that are looking at addressing, their own legal system. Perhaps some of my other European colleagues can say something more about that. But just let me answer the second. Sorry, what was your second question? Oh, yeah, alternative dispute resolution. So there's a long tradition of alternative dispute resolution research being done in the AI and law community. There's some in Europe. There's been a group in Australia who has looked at this as well. So they've looked at family law, for instance, and how you can use online dispute resolution for that. There's a very big event coming up in Liverpool in a couple of weeks as part of an international business festival, where they've got a number of people looking at online dispute resolution. They've got some of the justices from the UK system there. So there's people who have been developing platforms for that. There's a whole set of workshops that have been aligned with the AI and Law Conference, specifically on online dispute resolution. And what I said about the UK courts as well, they've been looking at that as well, and they've done a survey of that to try and see if they can use some of those mediation techniques in the UK legal system.
Okay, I think the last questions by Dino, because then we have to move on. Please.
So an observation and a question about the fact that in let's say AI, machine learning, data science, there's a booming of papers, proposals on explainable AI, interpretable machine learning models. In the last few years, it's really amazing the raise of interest on that. And I think that I see a risk. I see the risk that it's common to 12 years ago with the privacy-preserving analytics at the time, that there is a risk of diverging scientific effort. What I saw, for instance, in privacy technology from the computer science point of view, there has been a lot of, let's say, specific ad hoc techniques that never really impacted the real scene. I would really would love to see a different trajectory now for this explainable AI thing, which I think is of utmost importance. And I wonder how we can somehow foster better interdisciplinary collaboration so that the efforts are really well focused to practical tools that can help it along this road and avoid the risk I mentioned.
So I think there were some workshops mentioned yesterday, as you said, so this is the hottest of hot topics, explainable AI at the moment, and as I mentioned, I think there's been a bit of tribalism. AI often goes through this, so there's one technique, there's a new one that comes and usurps it, and everything was bad about the old one, and everything is great about the new one. So I think there could be some more joined up thinking, but between the different parties, and it just takes events that are being organised to get the different parties in the room who might be closer to one another in their thinking, who might be persuadable to look at other different techniques and see how we can put our heads together and come up with something that can address this important problem.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Kathy, also for these answers. Now we have a slight change in the program. Sorry, we are going to go back anyway into the issues of deploying AI in legal practice in the next session. So keep your questions and bring them back. Now I would like to give the floor to Clementina Barbaro. Clementina, she's from the Council of Europe. She's been working in the use of artificial intelligence in judicial system, an issue that we have been discussing in many of our previous presentations. Clementina has to go, and so we needed to anticipate her speech now, and the coffee break will wait for 20 minutes more. So please, Clementina, I'm happy to give you the floor.
So good morning, everyone. I would like to thank you very much, Professor Sartor, for inviting me to this conference. I thank all the participants for their patience in waiting before the coffee break. I'm happy to be here to provide the perspective of the European Commission for the Efficiency of Justice. I am an administrator working in the Secretariat of the European Commission, in the CEPEJ. I mean, it is called CEPEJ, and it's most known as CEPEJ. I see that there are many people coming also from the United States, so just a quick word to say that we are at the level of the Council of Europe, and CEPEJ is a commission which has been set up with a view to promoting efficiency and quality of justice in the 47 Council of Europe member states. Efficiency and quality are key issues when it comes to, let's say, starting deepening the issue of the use of artificial intelligence in judicial systems. We are currently working on it with a colleague, Yannick Menesser, who is a magistrate and an IT specialist. Myself, I'm a lawyer, and there are 3 experts involved. One is president of an appeal court who tested one of these predictive justice softwares. One is an IT specialist, and one is an expert on data protection issues. So we are trying to bring together different perspectives, because more than ever, interdisciplinarity is needed to tackle the challenges which are ahead of us. So let me start. First of all, about where this work comes from. It comes from observation. It comes from observation of several developments which are taking place in Council of Europe member states. First of all, a new trend, which is to make judicial decision available in the form of open data. And it is key because judicial decisions are the fuel for artificial intelligence, which is the machine. So there is a growing tendency in that respect. And also, there are more and more, as Katie said, new applications which are developed by the private sector and brought to the attention of legal profession. I fully agree with Katie. It's a big party, and everybody wants to get in and eat a slice of the cake. So, and of course, I mean, what we would try to do in that respect, through this ongoing work, is first of all to help really to provide justice decision makers, who are in fact our main recipients, because I forgot to say, the work of the CEPEJ is followed mainly by ministries of justice, High Council for the Judiciary, and so on. So we would like to provide them with key for understanding some of these applications which are brought to their attention, and there is really, and they turn to us to ask us, but what is the degree of trustness that we can give to them? Can they be deployed to the judicial sector or not? There are a number of issues which are being asked, and we would like, our perspective is to be clear about what are the possibilities, but also the limitations. We would like to provide a key for an informed debate. It is clear that there is a great potential, as I said, so, as I said, building bridges between IT and the legal world is really important, because otherwise the solutions proposed do not work in reality. Yeah? So, of course, the Council of Europe is our concern is also to bring a human rights perspective in dealing with this issue, and of course also advise on governance and ethical aspects. So how to deal with this phenomenon, this ongoing phenomenon. So I will start first of all, I mentioned earlier that the case law is the fuel for artificial intelligence. And as you know, we are today, I mean, we are seeing a global movement for transparency of the public actions. There are many institutions such as the Open Government Partnership, which really plead for the transparency, openness of public action. And so there is a more and more a tendency to put public decisions available in the form of freely downloadable databases, including court decisions, so to put them in the form of open data. So, but first of all, I would like to, we think that there is a lot of confusion about what so often there is, it is said that open data enables better access to information. But if you look at this, is not automatically true because there are many already existing applications which enable citizens to get access to information and perhaps even in easier form than a raw structured database. So access to data doesn't mean automatically access to information. Sometimes it is said that open data offer make court decisions contribute to improve the publicity of court decisions and the transparency of justice. And here we have an example. So you know very well that in all court decisions there is a formal obligation as part of a public justice to put available and to publish the name of the judges and clerks who have contributed to the decision. So here the issue is that one thing is to make these names available because, as I said, it's part of the publicity of justice. One thing is to think about the use which can be done through artificial intelligence applications if we put this in a way which then can be used by the machine. Because there are, of course, some concerns which could arise in the terms of the profiling of a judge. They have already been, so in a way, crossing together the possibilities of lots of big data, so to know better who is your judge, what could be his tendencies in judgment and so on. And same as, of course, for forum shopping practices. So I have here an interesting case study, which is the case study of France. There was a strong political will at the beginning of 2016 to put all judicial decisions, except really very specific types of litigation, in the form of open data. Of course, as I said, our concern for the Council of Europe is also to point out possible concerns in terms of human rights protection, and clearly here there are a number of data protection issues which come in. Because the systems really to conceal people's identity are not fully in place. We can best talk about pseudonymization than anonymization. So once again, let's be careful about the use which can be done of this massive information when it is processed by the machine. So here we see there are many examples, as Katie was mentioned, and there are here just a few. We are focusing in particular on some, in our study, on one particular application, which is the so-called predictive justice. First of all, predictive, I mean, we were also thinking about the terminology, where sometimes predictive, in a way, gives us the impression that we are able to anticipate something completely unexpected. It relates really to clairvoyance. There are supernatural abilities without that, whereas we know that many of the predictive justice solutions which are proposed today relate more to forecasting. They part from the observation of decisions already given in the past. So you might have heard about this study about the UCL, about predicting the decision of the European Court of Human Rights, where the success rate for the prediction was about 79%. We tried to find out how in reality this result was reached. And so first of all, it was reached using techniques of machine learning, and what it was done basically was to identify a group of words, record their frequency in the text, and then associate them to binding or non-binding decision. So we saw that, as I said, 79% rate in predicting decisions starting from the facts of the dispute, but a lower rate, only of 62%, when the machine had to analyze the arguments made by the judge. 62% if you think that there is a 50% random, let's say, possibility to predict, it is a bit lower in my view. So here you see the mechanisms which are in place. As I said, certain words be given, mostly frequently leading to a violation, being given a positive weight, and other words leading to non-violation being given a negative weight. So this is more or less the logic which is behind many of these predictive justice applications which are developed today. I say more or less because in reality we don't know what it is behind, because we know, I mean, we read from, even from conference papers and so on, that is a combination of machine learning and natural language processing, but as a matter of fact, the explainability of the algorithm, it is not known. We know what they tell us, so they tell us that through this software, the machines are able basically to predict, to give a success rate, a probability rate of the judge, let's say in a way, approving the arguments put forward by one of the parties. They give us also the success rate in terms of a given court or a given judge, and they give also an average allowance, because they are frequently used in, for instance, in divorce cases where there are issues of giving, let's say, custody to children, or sorry, to give, I don't find the prestation compensatoire, so compensation for one of the child to take after the children and so on. So there is an average which is calculated. And so what are the findings that we can, that we can draw from these tools? First of all, that they do not reproduce at all legal reasoning. There is just a statistical and probabilistic approach behind that, where correlation is supposed to replace causality. So the idea is to put a lot of data, judicial decision in the machine that the machine can process, and then collect this data to a given outcome. But let's say the trends and the patterns which are in between, I mean, we don't know to which extent, you know, they can be trusted. They are correlations, they are not causalities. And so this, it sounds odd then when we read in certain of these, by certain statements of the promoters which say that predictive justice can explain the behavior of judges. Because this is really going far beyond what the machine can do, because very often a decision of a judge will take into account many contextual factors. This is the big limit of these techniques today, that they are unable to contextualize the diversity of situations which the judge has to decide upon. So, and also, I mean, our point of view is that prediction is certainly something which can better achieved in certain fields, for instance, in the fields of mathematics and science, but we argue that a court decision is not really the best material for, to be processed by computer, because it's, first of all, the quality of the material can be very uneven. Not in all Council of Europe member states there are rules concerning the quality of the court decision and how the court decision should be written. You have lots of dissimilarities. And then there is all the application of the law by the judge, which is a process which is very difficult to formalize. So all the real, truly causative elements of the decision are very difficult to identify. So, and this is why at one of their testing, these predictive justice solutions really didn't fly. You see, they were tested, one of these predictive justice tools was tested in the Court of Appeals of Douai and Rennes, and you see here the statement of the deadline of the newspaper, from revolution to disillusion. I can, if there is time, I can certainly explain why these tools really didn't meet. In fact, they were proven not to meet the needs at all of, they were not fit for the needs of the judges who were working in these courts. So, the points of concern in all the use also of the predictive justice tools in civil matters, first of all, they relate to the place that these tools are going to have in the decision-making of the judge, because clearly we know that the judges are supposed to apply the law, so what should be, I mean, what should be the place that these tools take in this decision process? We see that, we say that it should be only an element to the decision of the judge, among many others. There is all the issue about the crystallizations of the case law, because the data, they belong to past decisions, so you risk really also to limit the evolutions of case law, and all the sources are confounded, from first instance court to high level, to Supreme Courts. So, and also there is a risk of performative effect, so that the judge, by looking at the results, the probabilistic results given the machine, will just simply mechanically apply them without looking any longer to the particularities of the case that he has to judge. And this could also, of course, have an indirect effect over judges' impartiality. There are other possible applications, because as I said, our work is also to highlight what it is good and what could really serve the interest of the justice profession. So certainly there are immense possibilities in terms of valorization of the case law, where there will be a possibility to create interlinks, better interlinks between the different sources of law, and for the judge to navigate on them. And then, of course, another very interesting, other interesting fields are the determination of compensation scales. Today, they are based on those, but let's say for of 20, 30 decisions, then there is a possibility to have perhaps more far numbers of decisions, and then let's say for to make them more, let's say, in a way to be more useful, in a way to provide a better data set for the judge that it is the case today, provided that we do not fall in what it is a mass statistic. So there should be always an attention to the quality of the data that are embedded in, and also the issue of the access to a judge is very important. So at a certain point, if the elements brought by the machine enter into trial, there should be a possibility to discuss them. I will quickly go to the applications in the criminal field. They mostly come from the United States, but we start seeing some applications also in the field of custody. So it is the idea to predict reoffending, and determining whether a person could be considered a low, medium, or a high level risk. You see here some example, unfortunately it's too slow, but of the very famous Compass questionnaire. What is the idea behind this questionnaire is that the offender is asked to fill it, and then all these questions, they are considered risk factors. So the more you share risk factors with people who have reoffended, the more you are considered high risk. Of course, we see concerns from this point of view in terms of discrimination and mistakes, very well highlighted in already existing doctrine, with this kind of algorithms in a say predicting offense rates twice for Afro-American population than for white population. The issue of the transparency of the algorithm, which has already been raised, is something very important. So as I said, really possibility for adversarial debate when the elements of the machine, let's say, of the statistical processing of the machine is brought into trial. And then, of course, as I said, the issue of the place, which place, how much judges should take into account the results of these instruments when they make a decision. And here we see risk, of course, because especially in systems where there is a high pressure from the executive on judges, or where there are very low statutory guarantees for the independence of the judiciary, it could be very easy for the judge to say, I prefer to leave the decision to the machine. So, after all, again, talking about the applications in the criminal field, we see perhaps the risk of resurgence of determinist doctrine in criminal matters, because the reality is that these tools, they end up penalizing certain communities more than others. And so it is just because you have a poor level of education, because you come from a poor area, that you have better, in a way, higher chances to get a higher prison sentence. In alternative to this, what we think is that AI should be used to put together different sources of information which allow us to say whether the individual is really committed to a rehabilitation pattern, which are now split among different sources, labor service, health services, and so on. So, and in this case, in this case, AI application could be always useful, provided there is a control by the human, so by a judge or by a probation officer. So, I said at the beginning of my presentation that one of our goals is to advise on governance, and on governance, first of all, because we say that in this field there is need to be cautious, not to implement these solutions quickly. There should be time for reflection, for meeting and bringing together the different professions, IT specialists, justice professional, and so on, and try to test the solutions first to see whether they really meet the needs, and that before deploying them at a broader scale. And then the issue, which has already been raised many times, of the accountability of the private actors who develop the solution, of transparency and control, accompanied by cyber ethics. So, and in this case, what we would aim to do at the end of our work, which is in any case going to be adopted in December of this year, is first of all, it's a charter of cyber ethics in processing judicial decision, where we say very clearly that processing of judicial decision should be driven by clear goals, should be in line with the requirements of the European Convention on Human Rights, need to make the methodology behind it transparent and certified by an independent authority. And of course, I finished, and cyber framework should be really a framework for guiding the operators in the field. So I finish here, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Clementina. I think that unfortunately we don't have no time for questions at this time, even though your presentation certainly offers a number of issues, and I'm sure that a lot of people would likely to express, to put questions to you. But your presentation will be made available, and no, we keep in contact, and we hope to have you here again with more time.
Of course, I will be happy to answer any question. I will provide my email address so that you can contact me if you wish so.
So thanks a lot. Now we move to the coffee break.